I'm going to be talking to you today about unstructured data and file access manager. We will also go through a demonstration. So just a bit of an agenda. We're going to discuss what we mean by identity governance for files and the sale point view on that. We are also going to then look at how file access manager can help with that. And alongside that, we will have a demonstration as well as a questions and answers. So just a brief introduction into what we mean by identity governance for files. It's really there to look to address a number of governance initiatives. And they're up on the screen there. We have many conversations with organizations and often they are really looking to understand what they don't know. So looking to identify and classify their information, their data that they know they've got out there, they know that there's a problem with it, but they just don't know where to start. As part of that process, it's often a requirement to start to establish some ownership around that. Who is accountable for the data? And a big reason for that is the actual governance and controls that ultimately we need to place around this unstructured data. That in turn helps us to meet any regulatory compliances or audit requirements there as well, and to become more efficient. And with efficiency gains, you end up with a better hygiene of your data, you're more in control, and obviously then there's productivity and efficiency gains and cost savings. Alongside that, we aim to start to efficiently mitigate those security risks to get to a stage where more proactive with the governance of the data. And that in turn, everybody is moving to the cloud one way or the other from conversations I've had in the last few years. And so it's really there to ensure that your data, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, is supported and correctly monitored. It's not just SailPoint that have been saying this for a number of years. It's certainly the analysts as well, such as Gartner and Forrester and IDC and the like. And we can see here, this slide actually shows us where we're not too far away from what Gartner are talking about here is really combining the visions around application control and unstructured data or data governance, and having those two as a comprehensive approach. And it really does kind of make sense. Another one here from IDC that in the past stating that organizations have underinvested. They may have gone down one track and secured their applications, their mainframes, their databases, etc. Historically, those have been better controlled anyway. There's less access, and it's seemingly easier to address. And unstructured data kind of gets left behind and forgotten about. But you need to look at all those doors and close them off appropriately or control them. So essentially, what we're saying is that identity governance for files is about ensuring that the right people have access to the right data at the right time, having that appropriate access, just enough access to get their jobs done, and to keep on top of that as well and make sure there's processes in place to ensure that this isn't just a one-off task and it becomes part of business processes. And with that, I'd just like to introduce File Access Manager. So IdentityIQ File Access Manager, to give it its full name, is there really to address the file storage side of things, the unstructured data. So, SailPoint have been in the business of looking at applications and infrastructure and securing that through our identity governance, of which, we're Gartner leader for year on year. And really extending that through and looking at the file stores as well. And it absolutely makes sense. And the glue to all of this and the unique element is right in the center of the screen there, is the identity, is the who. Who is behind those accounts that maybe are multiple accounts for touching different databases, accessing OneDrive, accessing on-prem file stores or email. Might be a multitude of accounts, but behind that there's the one unique identity, and that's really the approach that that we take with this. As I alluded to earlier, the governance for files is more tricky. It's different because of the fact that historically data has just exploded. Data storage is relatively cheap to buy and to manage, comparatively cheap, I should say. but with that comes a lot of unknowns. If we look on the left-hand side, applications, systems, and database-driven environments generally have their own layer of application security, have their own limited licenses, because things such as SQL are expensive. You can't have the whole organization having access to SQL. Whereas on the flip side, on the right-hand side there, we see that file stores, it's just a bunch of terabytes, petabytes of data that just gets dumped, gets created, gets ingested, gets merged from acquisitions, and everything in between. And there's a lot of unknowns. The data is unknown, it's unclassified, we don't know the usage of it. And it's potentially, unlimited file stores now, especially as we start to talk about divesting into the cloud there. So that brings with it some challenges. And one of the things that we talk about is around how do we prioritize this? How do we focus in on those challenges? Well, file stores are defined per container. So they have, either on a folder or a SharePoint site, there's the files within that. So we have all the permissions that are attached to that, controlling that data. We then look at the data itself, and that's unclassified. We don't know what that data is, whether it's PCI, whether it's PII, or anything else in between, maybe intellectual property. And we don't know who's doing what with the access they have. There are native auditing systems out there, but there's a lot that can't be done with those systems, because it's not really correlating this information together. And as you can see, it's only when we do that, we can then, through this kind of Venn diagram, explains it quite well, we can then identify the risk. We can focus that risk and say, well, we need a governance program that looks at the sensitive data, maybe the sensitive data that is unrestricted, where everyone within the organization's got access to it. But how about we look at that? We also look at where it's not being used. So we have uncontrolled PII that is not being used. When we look at it from, say, a GDPR perspective, we can defensively delete that. We need to do something with that information. We can't hold on to PII if we're not using it appropriately. We haven't got the right controls in place on that data. So that's really what we talk about, is a risk-based focus to this governance. I'm just briefly going to chuck in a couple of the slides around the architecture of File Access Manager. So just to really highlight the top level here, we can see the different functions that File Access Manager provides us. We can go out and understand what data is out there and classify it. We can understand the permissions that are attached to that information, what controls we currently have in place, whether they're good enough or not. We can then start to look at it from a data owner perspective, because everything that I've spoken about so far is starting to pose these questions, these problem statements. So we need a way of introducing the business into this in a friendly and usable approach, so that they can take ownership. The ownership of data does not lie with IT any longer, not in the world we live in, with the numerous regulations that we have, and those potentially tricky questions that need to be asked. We need somebody that's close to the information, and that would be a business user, business unit perhaps, that knows the people that have got access. So we can help with that through an election process that I'll show you briefly. Access requests and access recertifications, again, is another strong piece, where we get a bit more proactive. We understand there's some issues, let's go and fix those. Let's provide the means and the capabilities for users to request access, and also for data owners to run through recertifications to, so that we can get to a stage that we've tidied things up and tightened things up. And alongside that, excuse me, feeding into this is the auditing piece as well, so real-time monitoring. We support a breadth of different platforms, and we continuously develop on others as well. So this just gives you a highlight. These are all kind of the main ones, and we support them to mainly the same degree. The one thing I'll call out is that we do not have data discovery for Exchange Online, so we can't look at the sensitive content of those systems. And nor do we, or would we really, for Active Directory. You can't really store data within AD as such. But pretty much everything else that I'm going to talk about, you can take it as read, is covered on these systems. But yes, what I'll do now is just to shift across to a demonstration so we can put some pictures to words. So File Access Manager is up here on the screen, and I'll just briefly show you through the dashboard here. So we've talked about numerous different themes, looking at sensitive data, data ownership, how we start to address all those elements in between. And this is really what the administrator would see, this admin view. So we can see that I'm logged in as the admin, so I've got full capabilities. We do obviously have granular ability to have a variety of different roles, different users can see different elements. So it's really here to understand, you know, what's going on within the system. So how are we looking? So we can see here that we've got some data ownership issues. We've got 187 resources. It could be a folder, it could be a SharePoint site, a Google Drive, etc. that is missing that accountability. There's sensitive data within that location and there's no owner. So this is something that we'd need to maybe generate reports on, we'd need to run campaigns on, which I'll show you in a moment. Aside to that, we have the exposed information. So we have a metric to define what is overexposed. So typically that's everyone can access the data, or authenticated users, or a large cluster, a large collection of my user base. Let's say 75% or more can access data that is sensitive. So again, it's something that we can then focus in on, going back to that risk-based prioritization that I mentioned earlier on. As we move down, we can see how things are running with regards to activities. Activities can then fire off alerts. So we can create and have alerting, proactive alerting from this real-time monitoring. So we can start to understand if there's real issues, maybe the things within Active Directory, you know, that accounts are being locked, that we've got failed logons, is it some sort of snoop that's going on? Have we got users that are being added to groups when they shouldn't be, etc. You know, right through to other alerting, maybe that large amounts of data is being deleted by a single user within a short space of time. Maybe it's malware, you know, they're very noisy elements that we can pick up on, and everything in between there. We can see how our classification policies are currently running. We can also see down here on the left-hand side where we tie these elements together to understand that actually in my environment here, that under my human resources folder, the directory rather, we can see that we've got some categories of information, some PII, some active HR data, which all stands to reason, you know, there's actively processed PII occurring within human resources. On the face of it, that seems expected, not too bad. And we can see here where our campaigns that we have implemented are running and how well they're doing. So we can see here if there's, you know, direct permissions reviews, whatever you want to set up within the schema of File Access Manager, we can then run reviews on and push those out to the data owners. So just to give you a little bit more in-depth sort of information here, then if I was to focus in on the Windows Server, and in fact I'm going to look at the HR department, just to give you an idea, what we are doing is to crawl the target server or application, as we call it, to understand a couple of things: the directory structure, to also then understand the permissions as to who's got access to what currently. What we can do then is start to slice and dice this information up. Now, I will just take a moment to say that everything that I'm showing you is available within reporting as well. So, you know, just take that as read, that if there's data that you need to push out to maybe, you know, some sort of BI tool or for, you know, executive reporting, etc., then we can certainly achieve that. But yeah, just to show you here, we can see where there's permissions. We can delve into it deeper if we want to and understand how a particular user, such as Michelle, has gained access to human resources. Well, look, you know, she's got full direct control to this data. She's also a member of 3 groups which afford her access, some through some nested grouping here. This is a fairly simple permissions path, I would say. Typically organizations, you know, I've been in a place that had a random user that we looked at had over 60 different ways of accessing one fairly innocuous folder. And that kind of exemplifies the problem here, is that there are so many different ways of accessing the same piece of information. What is, you know, the right access? What is appropriate access? And we will come on to that in a moment, and I'll show you how we can help to achieve that. What we can also do with permissions analysis is to look at it from an overexposed perspective. So we're tying it in, saying, look, we've found some PII, some sensitive information, whatever that might be, but we also understand that everyone has got access. So, you know, if I look back or reference the dashboard I showed you a moment ago, and we saw that there was human resources was actively processing PII, I wasn't too concerned on the face of it, but now I'm much more concerned, because now I can understand that everyone, all users, have got access to my human resources folder and the sensitive data in here. This is obviously bad news. This is something that we need to address. And we can do that through a number of ways. It could be as an administrator through File Access Manager. I can make changes, make auditable changes, and you know, remove some obvious elements such as the everyone group and that side of things. But one of those other things that becomes a little bit more difficult is, well, if it's less obvious, what do I do? If it's a particular user group, do I know that it's appropriate access or not? And that's really when we start to look at it from a data ownership perspective. So a real strength that we have is the ability to look at it from an election process. So not just this view, which shows us where the most frequent users are, and we've had the most frequent users added in, but I could, if I chose to run an election campaign. I can define the subset of users that I'm sending this campaign out to, and it's really just a survey. It looks very much like this. And it would go through to users that we feel are appropriate. Maybe it's the most frequent users, and they would have the ability to vote on who they think should be the owner of, you know, this location. They can also suggest another user if they wish. They can also say, I don't know, you know, I just don't know, don't ask me again. So that information is then wrapped up, and it's a bit of an iterative process, but ultimately it means that we can poll the business and understand who should be set as the owner. Why are owners important? Well, it means that we can give them the tools and and enable them so that they have the reporting yet and the tools and the UI to help to govern this information. So if I was to switch over to Michelle, we can see here that I'm actually logged in under Michelle Perez now. She has already been set as the data owner for human resources. And this is the sort of view that she may well see. So she gets a subset of the data. She can see and drill into these elements to understand where her overexposed data is. Maybe there's some staleness there, and maybe there isn't. And it's from this view that she can then be prompted. Maybe it's come through from an email and it takes us straight through to, say, an open access review, as we can see here. So, you know, we've already understood from me clicking around in the UI that we have an overly accessible HR folder. And that's where the File Access Administrator would then wrap up a campaign, send it through automatically to the data owners, and Michelle would be presented with this. And as you can see, I've already been in here looking at some of this data. But the point here is that Michelle can be presented with this information in whichever way she really wants to. You know, there's quite a few columns in here. We can plug into, say, our sister products, IdentityIQ, which you see the references here, which is one option. But what we're aiming to do is to give the data owner enough data so that they can make a educated call on whether this access is appropriate or not. So we can see here, Sarah Campbell's been accessing the data. It was last used fairly, well, actually a little while ago now, but you know, we're approving these elements, we're rejecting some others, we're placing some comments. We can all see that these are active employees. All of this is configurable. And the one thing I would say about this is that it's good. We've got 276 to go through. You know, in an enterprise environment, that's probably quite small. I've seen this with tens of thousands of lines. Now here comes the issue. You end up with, you know, certification fatigue. You've got people that are just, you know, click heavy and just go through or bulk approve it all. And so we aim to address that as well by, you know, changing the view potentially. Maybe we look at it based on, you know, department, maybe, you know, maybe it's Active Directory department, etc. We can see that here. So in this case, I get a much cleaner, clearer view, and I can say, well, yeah, maybe I want to approve all of Human Resources Department for accessing human resources data. It kind of makes sense. You've seen here that I've already clicked to reject all as far as the engineering is concerned. And with any of these, I'd have to give a reason as to exactly why I'm rejecting or approving that access. So there's many different ways of carving this information up. The key thing is that we get this job done as swiftly and as easily for the data owner. They would then commit this. So this is a committal that could effectively tell File Access Manager to go and make those changes out on the live environment. Or this committal could essentially be to send it up to a higher power, somebody at the higher levels of review status, and they would then sign off on it before it's then committed out. Those committals are then audited. We have an engine that makes those changes, and all of that's reportable on as well. So over the course of time, you can get to the stage where you are tracking, you can see those tangible improvements, you can report up to the business and say, yeah, in the last 3 months, we've run 20 successful campaigns, we've reduced the access by a magnitude of X amount, and there's efficiency gains as well. People don't need to come through the help desk to request access to data. Everybody can choose a new access request from their UI, for instance, here, and go through and request access in a fairly easy way and manner there as well. And so you can become much more proactive and get to the stage that you are keeping on top of all of this. I am just going to very briefly delve into a couple other areas that I often get asked about, and that's really around the classification of data and then also the alerting piece as well. So the classification of data is something that we can provide in a very swift manner. We have a number of different system policies, out-of-the-box policies, and those policies are made up of a number of rules, of which we have over 100. And each rule contains its own logic, its own operators, its own criteria, and its own values and terms, etc. So maybe it's just literally a dictionary of terms, maybe it's something a little bit more complex. But we've done a lot of the legwork here for you. It means that you can create your own bespoke policies, and you can then target the particular areas and scan them and pull in those elements of information. As we can see here, we're classing this as GDPR data. Maybe it's a case that we want to go out and understand if we've got any PCI information out here. And again, we can class and categorize these, I should say, under whatever we want. These are all quite configurable and bespoke. And this is important because it means we can then sort our risk, I suppose, to understand if we've got high risk PII data versus low risk PII data, dependent on what we're looking for, dependent on where we're looking for it. So you can then, run reports based on these categories. One of the other elements that we have, which is a uniqueness to SailPoint, is the ability to tie up our auditing and the the activities that we're pulling in, and then classify based on that. So we can see here in this very simple rule that I created, I'm saying that if the user that's touching the data, they're a member of the human resources department as far as AD is concerned, and we're seeing more than 50% of the activities in the last day, then those data touches will then be classed as being, active HR data. So that's quite important, because it really means we can then start to map the usage of data, and we can then from that understand whether it's appropriate access. I use this example because maybe there's a legitimate HR activity, but it's occurring on a file share that IT just don't know about, but it's holding HR information. So one way of understanding that would be to look at the activities. And, all of this is configurable across, larger time periods. You can pull in a whole different load of different criteria as well. It doesn't have to just be AD dependent. It could be based on the actual files, what types of files, or the type of user, or how they sit within your HR system. There's quite a few different options there. But essentially, Once we've classified the information, as I've shown you, we can understand the risk associated with it, but then we can start to be more proactive. And just looking and linking back to the behavioral classification rule that I just showed you, this is then an alert to say that if we're seeing data that's actively processed by HR outside of the HR share, then alert me. So, this goes back to that category of active HR data that I just showed you. And in my demo, I've forced it so that if there's any activities on this location, then alert me, just so I got some alerts in my demo, to be fair. But essentially, you can combine and create these rules as you wish and as you see fit. And I'll just give you an indicator. I've been talking about it quite a lot. You can, it's very easy. You can choose a different types of attributes. Maybe that's what I'm saying, that it's any of these types of actions. It could be reads, it could be writes, deletions, etc., etc. It could be whatever you wish. And then we could potentially set a threshold on it as well. So we're saying that if we see multiple activities within a space of time by a particular user or on a certain location, then alert me. Don't just send me an alert every time somebody reads a file. That's pretty useless. So we can be quite intelligent about it. We've also got some more advanced settings of pushing the data out to SIEM solutions via SNMP or syslog, or running some other clever routines, etc. But ultimately, I just wanted to show you those elements as well, as it kind of all ties back up to what we're seeing in the dashboard there. So yeah, that kind of covers everything off, quite high level. There's a lot more that we can do from a forensic capabilities and reporting and permissions and that side of things. But I will leave that for another day. So I'd just like to revert back to the PowerPoint for the time being. Let me just see if we've got any questions at this moment. Okay, so yeah, so just one question. So thank you for that. And it's really around what I think is the best approach. So it's a nice question. And I think it does come back to the risk-based approach that I mentioned earlier on the slides. The best approach really is to raise that visibility first, to understand what you don't know. So to perform those early discoveries, to understand the structure of the data, to understand who's got access to what currently, and then you have to be iterative about it and configure the classification so it works for you and your environment. So that needs a little bit of tuning, I would say, as all engines do, and then to really use that to define where there's sensitive data, and then start to wrap those campaigns around it, as I showed you, with Michelle Perez as the data owner. So you can start to do those quite easily on a high level, where everyone's got access to sensitive data, where everyone has got access to file shares that shouldn't be open. Those can be remediated quite quickly, through the use of the data owner election and through the use of data owners being involved. But even before that, administrators, the IT admin guy can understand that actually everyone shouldn't have access to this data, and let's revoke it. And as briefly alluded to, we can perform all of those functions through File Access Manager. So yeah, thank you for that question. I'd just like to spend a few moments talking about the POC or data risk assessment that we offer. So we can engage with you from a risk assessment perspective and offer this as a free engagement. It's something that we'd need to work with you on to understand things in the first place. We have a finite amount of resources, obviously. But it's really, and I'll just whiz through these, it's really having an agreement in place in the first place. We will then talk over your current use cases where we feel that we can assist. And the point of that is just not to show you everything that File Access Manager can do if it's not useful to you. We need to understand, really what those business problems are. And we do that through what we call our use case discovery, so that we can align and provide that best value and that value fit. We will then, from a technical perspective, run through, we'll give you the what we call the prerequisites, and then a few days after that, once you've got things in place, we can run a pre-flight check, a remote session to understand whether all your systems are ready for the install day. The install itself, is run by one of the SEs here at SailPoint, and we will do what we call the core install of File Access Manager. Once that's in place and we're looking at Active Directory and starting to pull in some information, we will then extend that out and look at the endpoints. We typically won't be looking at too many endpoints as far as this free engagement is concerned, but something that you think will prove value to yourself and the business. So we don't need to look at 30 Windows servers. There's one Windows server will fulfill the need, I'm sure, but it might be that you want to extend out and look at the cloud, etc. So we will then have some configuration sessions to start to pull that data in from those endpoints, as we call them. We will then prove out those use cases. Maybe that could be on site, remote, or quite flexible, and equally at the end of it we'll have some reports and we'll be able to provide a wrap-up executive presentation, so that you have a takeaway at the end of all of this. You understand where you are, what you need to do in order to mitigate any risk and remediate in the future to become better governed as far as your unstructured data is concerned. So just wrapping up, and just to really re-emphasize what we've been discussing today, it's around the discovery piece to begin with, and going back to the question that was asked, it's around understanding what you don't know, raising that visibility. Once you've raised that visibility and you can identify these elements, you have that capability, it's then a point of reviewing it, starting to see where there is elements that are high risk to the business, and revoking that access, essentially, maybe remediating on the actual data as well, and performing those defensible deletions. And with that remediation comes some other sort of elements around, essentially cleaning AD. Most organizations need to do some housekeeping within Active Directory. In fact, every single one I think I've ever spoken to needs to do something. So it's all inherent, really. It's all intrinsic to itself. But then you start to get onto a state of being able to follow best practice, whether that's ISO standards, whether that's the fact that you are then increasing your efficiency so that your ITIL processes are better, let alone anything to do with GDPR, for instance. But once you can get to that stage, you can then put in place some levels of automation and some enhancements. So automations could be that off the back of some intelligence from File Access Manager, you're then able to programmatically, quarantine some data. We can give you that ability to enable you to then run scripts, for instance, to move information if it's from within unauthorized locations, and really start to then enhance the business processes and controls around your unstructured data. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are some huge efficiency gains here, right through from, the fun stuff of creating reports for auditors, through to, the more troublesome issues of, real data owner identification, rather than having to go through manually to the business, rather than sending emails out, keeping Excel spreadsheets. Let's bundle all these things into File Access Manager so that you have a comprehensive approach to help to govern your information. And that's really it. I'm just going to double check to see if there are any other questions on the chat. We will be sharing out these slides. It's just a question about whether grab a copy of these slides. Yes. So yeah, absolutely, that information will be shared out in due course. So it just leaves me to say thank you very much for your attendance today, everyone. I hope you found that useful. It was a whistle-stop tour. Please do contact us, engage with us should you feel that you need any further information, want to go technically deeper on the solution, or indeed whether you want to pick up on the offering of the free risk assessment, and we can engage with you and talk you through that process in greater detail. So yes, thanks again. Have a good day and all the best. Cheers. Bye-bye.